Let's talk about operations strategy. To get started talking about operations strategy, I'd like to tell you a story about a small business in western North Carolina called Chattooga Woodworking. There's a lot of small furniture and woodworking companies in this part of the country because there's a lot of wood, I guess, and a lot of skill. This particular company makes a wide variety of stuff. Here are just three different things that they make. They do some subcontracting of the wooden parts of musical instruments for a company that makes musical instruments. Also a lot of musical instrument companies in this part of the country. They do some furniture. Like here is a desktop that they make. And they also do some architectural stuff. We can see, for example, they make a stair rail, excuse me. So what you've got here is what's called the routings, or part of the routings at least, for each one of these products that the company makes. The routings show the particular operation, like plane the stock, that's the wood, saw the blank, rough out the blank, and so on. And it shows the piece of equipment that's used for each operation, and of course these are the sequences. This is the sequence of the operations in which they occur, the first, second, third, and so on. So we can make a couple of observations from looking at these routings. There's a wide variety of operations that have to be done. The operations differ quite a bit from product to product. The order of the operations also differs quite a bit from product to product. You can see all three actually start at the planer, and then they go to a table saw. But then the sequence of operations becomes quite different. Typically, when you have operations with these characteristics, a wide variety of operations that have to be performed, you're going to want to use general purpose equipment. There's really not enough of any one particular operation happening to be able to to dedicate a piece of equipment just to do that operation. For example, we probably couldn't in this company, or there probably is not a high enough volume in this company of making these guitar necks to dedicate a piece of equipment and optimize a piece of equipment just to final shaping the guitar neck. So here you can see they're using drum sander to do that, but this same drum sander could be used for lots and lots of other operations, including other operations on the guitar body, as you can see on the right, or other operations for other products that they make. In this type of operation, the equipment tends to be laid out or organized by what it does, by function, in other words. Here we have a lot of drilling and boring equipment, all, as you can see, in one area, in one department, so to speak. And that, again, is a characteristic of lower volume, higher variety types of operations. If we tour the roof off this facility, here's what we see. Remember, we had all the drilling and boring equipment on the previous slide, all in one department, and here's the department here on our floor plan, and you can see similar departments for other material. Again, equipment grouped by the function that it performs. The name for that, as we saw in the previous slide, was a functional layout. Now, let's say we put a camera up at the roof of this building and pointed it downward, and if we kind of let that camera run for a day and then watched it in fast motion, we'd see the paths that the different material takes through the facility. And just think to yourself for a minute, if we did do that, what would the paths look like? Would everything follow pretty much the same path, or would there be kind of a bunch of different jumbled up kind of spaghetti looking paths? Again, thinking back to the characteristics of the routings, what would be your answer to that question? If you remember, the routing showed that different jobs or different products take different routings through the facility. So here we have, again, the routings for just three products, one yellow, one red, and one blue, and you can see that the routings are quite jumbled. That's another important characteristic of this type of operations environment, is jumbled routings. Another characteristic of this type of operation we can kind of get a sense of with this slide here. You've got a horizontal milling machine, and you can see a couple different things about this slide. There's a cutter head that's actually hollowing out this cavity in the guitar body. The cutter head has a certain diameter. The cutter head is spinning at a particular speed. It's set to a particular depth of travel here vertically. There's a table. Here the table is horizontal with respect to the cutter head, but that is not always the case. So again, this is a piece of general purpose equipment like we talked about before, and right now it's set up to mill out this guitar body, but the next job that comes on this piece of equipment may be very different, and all these parameters may need to be changed. Depth of travel, the cutter head itself, the speed of the cutter head, and so on. And that's an important requirement of using general purpose equipment in low volume operations, is the necessity of doing changeovers, changing over or setting up, changing from one job to the next. We don't tend to like changeovers in business, because when we're changing over from one thing to the next, we're not making stuff, and if we're not making stuff, we think we're not making money. Later on in the semester, when we talk about the goal, we'll see that life is not quite that simple, but generally that's a pretty good rule of thumb. So those are several characteristics of fairly low volume, high variety type operations. Let's say that there's a new business opportunity, though, for Chattooga Woodworking. There's a guitar manufacturer in the area that typically makes fairly high-end, lower volume, more expensive guitars, but it's identified an opportunity to manufacture more of a mass market guitar. That would be a guitar that they'll sell in higher volumes at lower cost. And because Chattooga Woodworking has been a good supplier for the higher end guitars, this guitar manufacturer has come to Chattooga Woodworking and approached it about fabricating the body and the neck for this higher volume guitar. But it's made it clear to Chattooga Woodworking that the costs have got to be lower and the volumes are going to be higher. Well, what Chattooga Woodworking does to respond to this opportunity is it realizes that the operations that it's got right now, the facility that it's got right now, is probably not very well suited to producing this higher volume, low cost guitar body and guitar neck. So what the company does is it leases some new space next door, and it dedicates that space just to producing the guitar body and the guitar neck. But as you can see here, the facility looks quite different from the facility that we saw earlier. What are the differences? Well, here they've dedicated a piece of equipment to doing each operation. So there's one thickness planer, for example, that's dedicated just to planing the stock for the guitar bodies, one that's dedicated just for planing the stock for the guitar necks, and so on. So, for example, one of the things that you must do when you set up this piece of equipment is set it to plane to a certain thickness, a depth between the cutter head and the table. And instead of changing that, they would basically just leave the piece of equipment set up at that parameter all the time. Speed of the cutter head, and so on. You can see that not only is the equipment grouped by what it does, so we have one group of stuff just dedicated to doing the guitar body and one just to the neck, but you can also see that the material or the equipment is also arranged in the order in which the operations occur. So this is a much more straightforward configuration in terms of material flow. Whereas before the material flow was very complex, here the material flow is very straightforward. It literally starts at one end of the line, comes out the other end of the line. So the planning and scheduling task is much simpler here. Because the planning and scheduling task is much simpler here, our work in process inventory is probably going to be quite a bit lower. Our utilization of each piece of equipment is probably going to be quite a bit higher because we just basically put one in as fast as we get one out. We pretty much know when material is going to show up at each operation. That's a lot harder to predict in the other operation where the workflows are very jumbled. Here we might be able to get away in this facility with labor that's got a little bit less skill. Why is that? Well, here in this case, they're only doing one thing or maybe just a couple of things, whereas in the other facility, the employees would have to do quite a wide variety of things. And they would have to, for example, read a work order, read a print, decide how to set up a piece of equipment to do what's on the print, know how to operate the equipment, and so on, for a really wide variety of things. Quite a lot of discretion, quite a lot of employee judgment involved, where here things are a whole lot simpler. The reason I start today's presentation out with the story is because the story is a nice illustration of business strategy and the relationship between business strategy and functional strategy. The particular functional strategy that we're interested in here is operations strategy. The company started out with what is called an intermediate type operations, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a couple minutes, and they moved to repetitive operations. The reason they moved from one to the other is because their business strategy changed. In particular, as we saw, the business strategy changed from fairly low volume, high variety, fairly high customization type environment to more of a mass production, lower cost, higher volume type environment. So let's break business strategy down in a little bit more detail. One way to think of a business strategy is to think of it as the set of competitive priorities that the business competes on. Different businesses have different competitive priorities. For example, McDonald's has very different competitive priorities than a white tablecloth restaurant, a fancy high-end type restaurant. McDonald's and other fast service, they don't like to be called fast food, fast service restaurants compete generally on price, speed, convenience. If you think about what might make you choose to go to Burger King instead of McDonald's, or Taco Bell instead of Kentucky Fried Chicken, the convenience, the price is probably going to have a whole lot to do with it. On the other hand, more high-end type restaurants, your real fancy white tablecloth restaurants, they don't really compete as much on those factors. They compete more on personalization, flexibility, and so on. You might well choose to go to McDonald's instead of Burger King because you can save 75 cents on your meal. But if you were taking a date out this weekend, you probably wouldn't want her to know that you chose one high-end restaurant because you could save 75 cents on your meal, right? But you probably would. That's probably not why you would choose one high-end restaurant over another. Again, you would be probably thinking more about some of these other factors. So competitive priorities are what a business competes on. Not all businesses have the same competitive priorities. Four sort of generic competitive priorities are cost, quality, time, and flexibility. I think cost or price is pretty self-explanatory. Let's talk about some of the others. Quality is kind of hard to talk about because quality can really mean a lot of different things. We might, some people might consider a car like a Rolls-Royce or something very high quality. On the other hand, we might consider a car like a Toyota Camry or a Honda Accord to be very high quality, and they're arguably both real high quality, but for different reasons. A Rolls-Royce is going to have superior features. Rolls-Royce is going to do more to personalize the car. coming off the production line to your particular order. There may be better service at the dealership, and so on. And we're really thinking more about high performance and those types of things when we think about a Rolls-Royce. On the other hand, Toyota has definitely become the most successful automobile manufacturer in the world by competing on quality, but it's sort of a different kind of quality. Toyota, with cars like the Camry and the Corolla, gets it right every time. The car has a set of specifications. The reason that I've spent a good bit of time talking about business strategy is because to understand functional strategies such as operations strategy, marketing strategy, information system strategy, finance strategy, and so on, it's important that we understand business strategy. And the key to that is the linkage. Operations strategy, marketing strategy, other functional strategies need to fit with the business strategy. In other words, they need to be aligned with the business strategy. Let's talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. But before I do that, I'd like to point out what I think is something that's not exactly correct in the book, and that is this figure from your book that indicates that competitive priorities in this green box, cost, quality, time, and flexibility, are elements of operations strategy. I think that we're better served by talking about them as elements of business strategy. Those are really things that businesses at the business level make the decision to either compete on as priorities or not compete on as priorities. Okay, so what we were getting at with this slide is the idea of strategic fit. The idea that the operations strategy has to be consistent with the business strategy. All the other functional strategies such as MIS strategy, marketing strategy, and so on also have to be consistent with the business strategy. As an idea from the marketing area, and we tend to understand marketing strategy a little bit better than operations strategy, I think, as people who haven't studied operations management very much, because marketing is a little bit more visible to us as consumers. If we have a very, very high-end product, at the business level, we decide that we're going to charge a lot for the product. There's going to be a lot of personalization. Maybe we're going to keep the product very up to date, constantly be bringing new versions of the product to market. For example, a real high-end piece of clothing. Our marketing strategy is probably going to involve fairly selective retail outlets. We might not want to sell the product through mass market discounters like Walmart, for example. We may not want to rely on things like coupons in the Sunday paper to promote the product. We would probably make other decisions for a very high-end product in terms of marketing that product. Again, the marketing strategy has to be consistent with the overall business strategy for the product. The same thing applies to operations management, as you'll see here. There are two basic operations strategies that your book discusses. The first is intermittent, and the other is repetitive. And in just a second, we'll break these down and understand the differences between them. But again, to link these back up to the higher level, back up to the business strategy, it's important to recognize, and we'll discuss this more, the intermediate operation strategy supports some competitive priorities or some business strategies very well, and others not so well. Similarly, the repetitive operation strategy supports other competitive priorities, different ones from the intermediate operation strategy quite well, and again, others not so well. So it's very important, regardless of whether or not you're going to work in operations management, to understand the linkages. It helps to think about operations strategies to kind of break down or categorize the elements that make up operations strategy. One set of elements are the outputs, and those are the competitive priorities that we've already been discussing. Another category of characteristics are the inputs, and we can further kind of think of inputs as the types of resources that are employed in the operation, and the type of layout in the operation. And when we were talking about Chattooga woodworking earlier, you could probably already get some sense of the differences between the two. a real systematic way to understand the differences between the two is through what's called the product process matrix. And let's talk about that here on the next slide. Okay, so here in gray we have some output characteristics or some competitive priorities, and we also have some input or resource characteristics. So let's start out talking about the output characteristics. Here on the next to the leftmost column, we've got intermittent operations and then repetitive operations. Intermittent operations tend to be good at producing high variety of outputs. The other side of that coin, I guess, is lower standardization. If you produce lots of different things, generally, you're not making just one or two highly standardized things. Generally, when we make a high variety of things, we're also doing that in relatively low volumes. In other words, for each different thing that we produce, each different model, so to speak, that we produce not very many of them. That tends to be associated with a higher per unit cost, and often as a result of that, higher price to the customer. The good news is that lower levels of standardization and lower volumes tend to enable faster delivery to the customer. If we think about that in terms of the time it takes to actually produce something that a customer orders. The flip side of that is the repetitive operations. Those tend to be lower variety, higher volume types of operations. Mass production, quote unquote, is a good example. Of course, because of economies of scale, we can do things on a mass basis at lower cost, lower price to the customer. But in terms of delivering something, how long it takes us to fulfill a particular customer order, repetitive operations can be quite a bit slower. And I think these will become more clear, or the logic for some of these will become more clear as we begin to talk about some of the input characteristics of the two different strategies. And again, it might be helpful as you're thinking about this to link back to the Chattooga woodworking story that we started out with. In terms of types of equipment, as you may recall, intermittent type operations, your high variety, lower volume types of operations tend to use more general purpose equipment. They don't have the volumes to dedicate a piece of equipment to a particular operation. That equipment tends to be grouped by what it does. Remember, we saw the slide of all the drilling equipment in one department. Another name for that, it's a real important term to understand, is a process layout. Again, equipment is grouped by the process that the equipment does. The flip side of that, or the alternative to that, is what's called a product layout, and that would be the two different assembly lines that we saw, or not assembly lines, but lines that we saw to make the high volume guitar body and guitar neck. There, remember, the equipment was grouped by what it did. There was one group, one line for the body and one line for the neck. So it's grouped by what it makes, or the product that it produces, hence the name product layout. You may also recall that the product layout was very straightforward. It's a line, right? Henry Ford's assembly line certainly kind of comes to mind. On the other hand, the workflow, the path that work follows through the facility was very jumbled in the intermittent operation. Every job basically followed its own routing through the facility. In a intermittent operation, customer orders are generally, and this is a bit of a generalization, generally what drives production, what initiates production. We're generally making something to a particular customer order, although not always. On the other hand, with repetitive operations, we're tending not to be making something to a particular customer order or a particular customer request. We're very often building to a forecast of what we think we're going to sell. Automation tends to be lower in an intermittent operation, and that has a lot to do, again, with the volumes and the ability to dedicate equipment to a particular purpose. If we have a high degree or a high volume and a low variety, Well, it typically is pretty easy to automate something where we don't have a lot of task variety, and if we have a lot of volume, it might make that investment in automation pay off. On the other hand, it's difficult to automate a piece of equipment to do a wide variety of tasks, so it's more expensive, and we've got less volume, so it becomes much more expensive than on a per unit basis. So automation tends to be a lot more cost effective in repetitive operations. We tend to see a lot more automation in repetitive operations. Now, this is another sort of generalization here on labor discretion, labor skill. But as I kind of indicated when I was telling the Chattooga woodworking example, in an intermittent type operation, there's a wide variety of tasks that need to be done. A lot of times an employee might be doing something for the first time, or he or she doesn't do something very often. He or she often has to interpret some type of customer order, some type of customer requirement, blueprint, something like that, and figure out for themselves how to do a particular operation or sequence of operations. All those things require a fairly considerable amount of employee skill, employee discretion. On the other hand, if we think about the actual primary contributor, the person who operates the process, in a repetitive situation, that person doesn't need to use as much judgment. That person doesn't have to do as high a variety of things, typically. So that person can be a lower skilled person. Now, it does take a tremendous amount of expertise to set up a repetitive type operation, an assembly line or a production line, a continuous flow line, but to actually operate it often doesn't require quite as much skill. Now, I know that's a generalization. It's certainly not true all the time, but it is true a lot of the time. Okay, let's talk about inventory. Because of the jumbled flows that we have in an intermittent type operation, it's much harder to figure out when a particular batch of material is going to hit a particular resource, a particular operation. On the other hand, with repetitive operations, we can get away with lower inventory because scheduling is kind of a no-brainer. We really don't even need to schedule particular work on particular resources. We just start a unit down the line, and as it gets done at one operation, it gets passed to the next operation, and eventually it comes out the other end of the line. You can't get much more simple than that. Therefore, work in process inventory is going to be pretty low. There aren't going to be a lot of traffic jams, bottlenecks, anything like that, because the flows are so simple. And that's the same reason why utilization tends to be fairly high in a repetitive environment. Scheduling is really quite straightforward. On the other hand, it's more difficult in an intermittent operation. Therefore, it's likely that there's going to be some time where we've got resources, machines, people that really don't have anything to do because there's a bottleneck or something like that somewhere else. A lot of work is kind of converged on another resource, and therefore that resource is basically starving some other resources. So there's quite a lot here in this table, and it would be a mistake to just kind of memorize the table. If you do the reading and kind of think about what we've just talked about, this should really make sense to you. If you think about the output characteristics, you should see that the output characteristics are kind of consistent with one another. And then if you think about the characteristics of the operations, it should make sense to you, for example, that general purpose equipment would be used when standardization is low, variety is high. And then if we think about using general purpose equipment, some of these other things start to make sense. It should be pretty clear if we're using general purpose equipment group by function, why workflows are kind of jumbled. So again, this table shouldn't really be something you should just have to memorize. This table should be something that makes sense to you. The product process matrix was originally developed by a couple of people named Hayes and Wheelwright way back in 1979, but as you can see, it still does quite a good job in helping us understand some key differences between operations and how those key differences correspond to business level strategy. I think the product process matrix applies pretty well to manufacturing, and it applies pretty well to services. A lot of the things. There's a couple additional characteristics. There are, however, a couple of service-specific characteristics that we should talk about, beginning with personalization and customization. This is pretty similar to the manufacturing-specific picture, where intermittent type services or job type services are going to give us higher levels of customization. However, customer involvement and customer contact is something that really isn't relevant if we're just talking about manufacturing. We almost never, when we buy a manufactured product, have contact with the manufacturing operations, the manufacturing people, and so on who produce the product, regardless of the degree to which the product is customized. However, customer involvement is much more important in services. For example, it's pretty difficult for you to get a haircut without having some pretty direct involvement and contact with the person who's giving you the haircut. On the other hand, not all services are that way. There's other services such as auto repair, where we might have a little bit of contact with the person who's repairing our car, but maybe not very much. And then some services where we have almost no contact. For example, if we buy shares in a mutual fund, we have basically no contact with the people that are operating that mutual fund. Moving down to some of the process input-oriented characteristics. Similar to what we looked at before, the employee skills differ between the two. In intermittent services or job type services, diagnostic skills tend to be very important. For example, in medicine, in automobile repair, in many aspects, being able to diagnose a problem and then apply judgment to figure out what to do is an important employee skill. On the other hand, that's not characteristic of all services. Repetitive services that are less customized, tend to rely less on employee diagnostic skills. For example, a flu shot clinic would be one medical application where there isn't really much diagnosis that needs to be done. In the auto care area, quick oil change type of operation, again, the employees don't need to do a lot of diagnosis. Their employees in these types of operations are more oriented towards following and executing procedures that have been laid out in advance. So less employee diagnosis, less employee discretion as far as what to do in particular cases. Location is also important to think about. Location is certainly important in manufacturing. It's important in services for other reasons. Your job type services, your more customized services, tend to be more decentralized in terms of their locations. We can continue to think about financial services a little bit. We think about a stockbroker. A stockbroker is somebody who is going to give you a fairly personalized portfolio, can customize it to your needs with a good bit of customer contact, and those tend to be fairly decentralized. There's stockbrokers in every town. Most of us probably live within a few miles of a stockbroker's office. Another approach to financial services is a common stock mutual fund, or any type of mutual fund, where there isn't very much personalization. If you buy shares in a mutual fund, you pretty much get what everybody else in that mutual fund gets. Not as much customer contact, and as a result, those operations tend to be much more highly centralized. Most of us don't live within a few miles of a mutual fund. There's only a handful of them, and they tend to be located in a few big cities. Here's just kind of a different look. It might be useful to some people of the product process matrix, and here it's applied particularly to services. Up here on the top left area, we have the more job type services that tend to be high personalization, high customization, but low volume. And then down here on the bottom and to the right, we have the lower variety, higher volume type mass services. We can see if we kind of follow this line to stockbroker, that tends to be lower volume, higher variety, higher customization, higher customer involvement. On the other hand, something like a mutual fund, again, is going to be higher volume, lower variety, lower customization, lower customer involvement. Okay, so it should be very clear by now that the business strategy and the operation strategy need to be aligned. Some companies don't understand this, and there's been some fairly well-known examples of companies that have gotten into trouble from not understanding this. Your book talks a little bit about Babcock and Wilcox, and you've got an assignment in this unit on Southwest Airlines and Continental Airlines. Bottom line is, it's a mistake to produce or try to produce a low-cost, high-volume type of output with intermittent operation. By the same token, it's also not a great idea to try to produce highly customized, high-variety outputs, or to try to do things on a very short lead time with a continuous operation. Continuous operations are very good at doing things in a cost-effective manner, but they're not particularly flexible in terms of the outputs. It's important for companies to realize that those really aren't viable positions. It may be the case that management identifies a new market. The business has traditionally competed on low cost, and management identifies a new market that requires a lot of flexibility or a lot of customization, a lot of variety. If that's the case, then management needs to think about changing the characteristics of the operations, or acquiring or developing new operations that are a good fit with that market opportunity. Alternatively, management can take stock of the existing operation strategy, the existing operational strength, and look for market opportunities that are a good fit for those types of strengths.